Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar this morning, which will focus on optimising crop nutrition through in-season checks and adjustments. My name is Sarah Kendall, and I work as a crop physiologist at ADAS, and I will be chairing the webinar. I know this is a really busy time of year, so we're really grateful that you have taken the time to join us today. And we hope that you can take some useful actions from the information that we share. Before we get started, I would like to cover some housekeeping points. So if we can just move to the next slide, that would be great. So the webinar is being recorded today, and a copy of the recording will be available afterwards. During the webinar, all attendees are muted and cameras are switched off, but there will be a chance, if you're keen, to unmute to ask your questions if you've got something a bit later. If you've got questions during the presentations, please add them to the chat. We're going to address any questions focusing on the technical presentation straight afterwards. And there will also be a Q&A and discussion at the end with our two farmers, Andrew and David, that have joined us this morning, where you can also ask questions as well. As I've said, if you want to actually ask your question, please use the raise your hand function and we will allow you to unmute. There will be basis and Naroso points available for the webinar, and a form will be shared, a link to that form will be shared in the chat for you to add your CPD numbers, so please make use of that. If we can go to the next slide. So I'm joined today by my ADAS colleague, crop physiologist Kate Storer, and we've also got colleagues Bree and Laurie behind the scenes who are helping to ensure everything runs smoothly. I'm also really pleased to be joined by farmers Andre Williamson and David Aglen, who have been part of the project, and they will join us for a Q&A session later in the webinar to really give some on-farm perspectives to what we're talking about today. So in terms of the content for the webinar, I will start by giving a brief overview of a novel approach for crop nutrition management, which focuses on plan, check and adjust, and review steps. I will also highlight some of the tools and technologies that can be utilised for measuring and monitoring crops. I'll then hand over to Kate, who's going to provide some insights and guidance into how in-season checks and adjustments can be used on farm. And then we'll invite David and Andrew to join us to give their perspective on how they are optimising nutrient management on their farms and the type of checking approaches they use. And we'll integrate questions from you into the discussion. So please engage with us and ask your questions. If we can move to the next slide, Kate. So I'll start by giving a summary now of our plan, check and adjust and review approach. Through a Europe-wide project which ADAS are leading called NUTRI-CHECK NET, we have come to recognise the urgency required in providing better support to farmers and advisors to enable them to optimise the crop nutrition decisions that they make. And to help facilitate this, we have developed a framework called three-step checking, which focuses on three key elements, and you can see those in this schematic on the screen here. So the first is plan, the second is check and adjust, and the third step is review. Whilst farmers generally consider the nutrient requirements of a crop by creating a plan, and most are good at planning, they rarely check and adjust that initial plan. And I think only recently have we as an industry start to realise the value that actually analysing the nutrient concentration of harvested produce, how that can contribute to revealing how well farmers' plans and adjustments have worked. On most farms, the success of nutrient applications and the decisions which guide those applications is generally determined by yield, and that's irrespective of the fact that many non-nutritional factors affect yield. So we can measure nutrient concentrations of harvested produce to help us to understand whether crops have captured insufficient, adequate, or excess amounts of each nutrient. And they enable farmers and advisors to review nutritional performance, soil nutrient balances, and efficiencies of nutrient applications. And this can help to inform future nutrition management on a crop by crop and a field by field basis. In the webinar today, we're going to focus on the second step, check and adjust, where we will explore how in-season checks can be performed to provide further refinement to the initial plan, which is often created when fertilizers are bought, and it doesn't necessarily account for how well crops have established or seasonal factors affecting nutrient requirements. So the checking stage is really important in making sure that the plan is still relevant. We'll discuss the relevance of checking and the scope for making adjustments across nutrients, and we'll generally focus today on winter wheat, although many of our recommendations can be considered for other crops too. I want to mention that later in the season we will hold 2 further webinars which focus on the plan and then the review steps. We'll share guidance on how to review before harvest to give insights on grain analysis, and will then provide information for planning in the autumn. If we can move to the next slide, please, Kate. In the NUTRI-CHECK NET project, we've catalogued tools, services, analyses, etc., which are available to provide information to farmers and advisors to support crop nutrition checks. There's obviously a huge number of tools available across Europe, and those include online platforms which present satellite imagery and spectral reflectance indices such as NDVI, to visually assess intra and interfield variation. Whilst some of these imagery provisions sit within paid for subscription platforms, there's also access through free of charge access to data through several platforms as well. So you don't necessarily need a paid for subscription to access some of this information. And some platforms also present estimates of crop N uptake and can analyse photos for green area index to help guide fertiliser requirements in line with canopy size. There are also several tractor-mounted or handheld sensors on the market that use reflectance to estimate crop biomass, colour and therefore nitrogen uptake, which can help guide future nitrogen applications. And finally, there are several labs both here in the UK and overseas which offer commercial analyses to measure nutrient concentrations in leaf or sap material, or also in root exudates to predict the protein concentration, which can help to guide further nutrient applications or diagnose nutrient issues. With lots of technologies available to support in-season nutrient decision making, we'll try and consider how to incorporate some of the principles behind these tools into a checking approach. Many of these tools may have merit and could prove to be very useful. However, in some cases, we found limited independent evidence to really back them up. So we're not able to necessarily to endorse those tools here specifically. If we can move to the next slide, Kate. So I just wanted to mention that through the NUTRI-CHECK NET project, the catalogue of tools that I've talked about are available online through a custom-built free of charge platform, which provides information about 172 different tools which can support nutrient decision making. And I'll pop a link to the platform in the chat a bit later in the webinar. If we can move on again. Yeah, I think it's really important to just acknowledge that obviously it's great if farmers and advisors can embrace innovations which can enable smarter nutrient management decisions to be made. But of course, it would be wrong of us to not accept the power of visual crop inspections, which many of you listening this morning will be making on a regular basis as part of routine crop walking. And I think trying to formalise some of these observations through record keeping can be extremely useful, particularly when feeding into next year's planning. So I'm now going to hand over to Kate, who's going to summarise really some of our current thinking around making in-season checks and adjustments. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. As Sarah says, I'm Kate Storer. I'm also a crop physiologist at ADAS. So Sarah's given us a nice overview of what we're going to be talking about in the webinar today. I'm going to go through a few slides to think a bit more in detail about what we mean about in-season checks and adjustments. So, as Sarah mentioned, the first step in checking and adjusting is really to think about inspecting your crop and using your crop as an indicator. So checks can be useful at lots of different stages, where it's not necessarily just one time point. So the first phase of checking is really looking at using the crop as an indicator, inspecting all your crops frequently in spring for nutritional issues, such as opposed to just looking at disease and pest incidents. Things that you want to be looking out for, which I'm sure most people are already doing routinely anyway, things like looking at the growth stage, the ground cover, plant count, shoot number, leaf cover, rooting, those kind of things. There's some really good benchmarks in the AHDB growth guides, which are good to refer to. Other things that you could consider checking at this point is looking at satellite images. Do they show any oddities? And are there any deficiency symptoms? And there's lots of resources online to identify symptoms, such as in RB209. And then finally, once you're going around doing that, you don't necessarily need to do in-depth checking on every field and every location. So you want to use this process to identify where you might prioritize your in-depth checking. So start thinking about which fields you want to target for further investigation, and identify if issues are part of a field, a whole field, several fields, or so on. The main phase that we're going to talk about today, though, is the checking to see if if you can identify any potential nutritional issues. So, but before you go into the depth of trying to do detailed in-season checking, it's important to think about why you're doing it and what information you're going to get from it to make sure it's a useful use of your time and resource. So the first thing is to consider, are you able to do anything about it? If you find that there is an issue or a deficiency, what can you do to adjust it within the season? And we know from independent evidence that products aren't necessarily always 100% effective or efficient. And we actually know that some products tend to actually only improve crop nutrient uptake by less than 10% of the nutrient that they contain. So it's really important to be aware of that and to correct for the efficiency of the nutrient uptake and any adjustments that you make. We also need to make sure that any applications meet a significant proportion of the crop nutrient demand and allow for any of these inefficiencies. Other things to consider are the crop that you're looking at. So longer lived crops are more likely, we think, to respond to any adjustments that you make, just based on the fact that they have more time to respond. And do you have time to be able to make an adjustment within the season? So, or is it getting a bit too late for the crop to be able to respond to any changes that you make? So these are all very sort of high level things just to think about before you go ahead and start doing lots of detailed checking. But it's important to note that even if you can't resolve the issue in season, it doesn't mean that doing the checks isn't a valuable thing to do. It might be that you think there might be a nutritional deficiency that you want to then go and follow through to see if it appears in the grain nutrient analysis, to see if there's a trend in the data. You might not have any intention of changing your plan this year, but if you start to see a pattern in the longer term, then perhaps next year you might be able to make some adjustments. So it's really just stepping back and considering why you're doing it and what you're hoping to use it for at the end. And another factor to consider when you're doing your checks is to think about ideally doing the checks on the area of the crop that you're a bit concerned about, and also a nearby area that doesn't have the same symptoms, because then you can really see if the symptoms that you're observing when you do your check are down to the nutritional deficiency that you're suspecting, or if there's maybe something else going on. So it is useful if there are time and resources available to do checks on two adjacent areas, one that looks like it maybe has an issue and one that doesn't. Once you're happy that you think that you've identified a nutritional deficiency that you can do something about, then the next step is to move on to adjusting your nutrient recommendation. So that might be applying more nutrient, but it also might be applying less nutrient, depending on what the issue that you've identified is. So you want to, as I've mentioned, account for the efficiency of the product and ensure the product meets the nutrient demand. And then also, if you can, leave an area untreated to test the adjustment to see if the adjustment you've made is actually doing what you think it's doing. And this is also really helpful when you're moving on to reviewing whether or not your adjustment was successful. And that review stage, you don't just wait until harvest. Ideally, you would monitor the crop continuously through the season. Have the symptoms disappeared? Is the crop growing as you would expect it to? And as I say, compare that with an untreated area if possible. And then finally at harvest, identify if you can see if there's success, potentially by using something like grain nutrient content to assess if that pattern has emerged. So I've just put in a slide to acknowledge that if you are thinking of leaving an untreated area, which is a really good way of testing if your adjustment has worked, you can do a really simple trial to see if that's happened. The simplest way is just to miss a tram line, but it's really good to identify and think about that before you go and do it. The main reason for doing that is because you don't want to bias the result. So if you're going to miss a tram line with a particular treatment, make sure you're not selecting a tram line that maybe has some other issues. It's not waterlogged or it's not on a different soil type. You can, if you have the time, plan in advance. So use things like satellite MDVI, which you can get freely available online, to help select areas that you want to leave treated and untreated to make sure that they are comparable and fair. And most importantly, don't forget to record your yield at the end of the day to see if it has been successful or not. Yield maps can be really helpful, just even visually, to detect if there are patterns in the field. There's a couple of guides which ADAS has created that are freely available on how to set up trials. So you can get hold of those on Farm Pep. So if you're interested, I'd recommend having a look at those. So that's the kind of overview. We've got a few examples now that I was going to talk through of checks. There's loads of different methods that you can use, as Sarah said earlier on. But I'm just going to focus on a few principles. And we're going to talk through these 5 examples today. So soil mineral nitrogen, spectral reflectance indices, specifically NDVI, broad spectrum leaf analysis, and malate sulfate analysis. And then we're also going to have a quick look at SAP testing as well. But the main thing is what is the level of evidence? And as Sarah mentioned earlier, we are lacking independent evidence for some of these approaches. So what we've tried to do here is have a look at where we've tried them out ourselves, or where we've got data, as well as looking at what evidence there is, to have a look at what we know so far, and how they might work in practice. So one thing that I will just note is that we will focus on nitrogen and sulfur today, and that's primarily because we think that we'll be most likely in succeeding in adjusting the mobile nutrients like nitrogen and sulfur, and we also have most confidence in our ability to adjust those as well. So we're going to mostly talk about those. So I thought we could start by looking at crop nitrogen uptake throughout the season, and this is the nitrogen uptake in a winter wheat crop. This is from the AHDB Wheat Growth Guide, and it's really just to highlight that most of the nitrogen taken up in wheat occurs before flowering. So the majority of the nitrogen uptake in wheat happens earlier in the season, prior to flowering. After flowering, very little extra nitrogen is taken up by the crop, so only about 30 kilos after that point. And actually, the main amount of nitrogen that gets into the grain is primarily being translocated from the leaves and the stems into the grain. So if you want to check and adjust your nitrogen uptake in winter wheat, ideally you'd primarily look at the start, the sort of earlier time in the season, around growth stage 30, 31, looking at this sort of steeper part of the uptake, because that's the point when you're most likely to see differences, and it's also most likely when you're going to be able to make any adjustments. So if we have a look at the first example of an in-season check that we are going to talk about today, we could look at soil mineral nitrogen. So just a reminder of what the RB209 guidance is for this. So we know that fields vary widely in the amount of nitrogen available before any fertilizer or manure is applied. And on the right here, these are data from trial sites that we've collected this year. So this is using the measurement method. And you can see here the brown bars show the soil mineral nitrogen, and the green bars on top show the amount of nitrogen in the crop. So you can see there's a lot of variability. These are all winter cereal crops. And you can see there's lots of variation between the different sites in the amount of SNS. And it's important to account for this variation because it ensures that you don't add too little nitrogen and you don't apply too much nitrogen, which is obviously very good for economics, but also for the environment. So you can estimate what your SNS index, your soil nitrogen supply index, is using one of two methods in RB209. The first one is the field assessment method, which most people will use, and that looks at using records of soil type, previous cropping, and winter rainfall. The second method is the measurement method, and this is the one I'm just going to talk a little bit more about on the next slide. This is where you take soil samples to measure soil mineral nitrogen. You also estimate the amount of nitrogen in the crop and also the amount of nitrogen available from mineralization. So when would you shift from using the field assessment method to the measurement method? So there was a big AHDB funded review on SNS carried out in 2012, and it's a really good report. There's a summary guideline that was produced from that, which you can still get hold of on Farm Pep. And this diagram is from the AHDB website, which summarizes the main outputs of that. And it effectively found out that SNS prediction overall is worthwhile compared to doing a very simplistic assumption of a fixed value. So it's certainly worth estimating your SNS index. However, they also found that most soils don't need the measurement method to be applied. The field assessment method was actually more accurate on average unless you did some corrections to the SMM measures in most situations. However, it's really important to recognize that some will benefit from a measured SMN value. So it's those situations to think about, particularly to confirm and manage anywhere where you might have predicted high or uncertain soil nitrogen supply. So it's those ones where you want to focus your efforts on checking potentially and adjusting your nitrogen requirements based on measurement method for SNS. So when we talk about uncertain, that could include things like wet winters or high residues. Wet winters, although as this winter hasn't been such a wet winter, the previous two winters were incredibly wet, and we did see differences in the results of SNS or SMM measurements as a result of that. So particularly with climate change, we're seeing these sort of more extreme winters. It's worth bearing in mind and considering if there are particular situations where you might consider that being uncertain and checking it. Another thing to bear in mind is on the AHDB website, there's an excess winter rainfall tool, which is really good at helping to identify those areas which have had higher levels of excess winter rainfall than expected. And that might help you to also identify if it might be worth trying a measurement method approach in a given season. But it's also very useful to get those numbers for your field assessment method approach as well. So I've just got an example of where we've tried both of these methods in one of our trials. This was from the Nutrition Challenge last year. So on the first column here, we've got what we've called the standard RB209 field assessment method. It's a very basic interpretation of RB209, so we haven't done any real adjustments. We've just taken the very simple approach. And then in contrast, we've used the measurement method, and we've done lots of different adjustments and checks within that approach. So the first thing you can see that's different between these two is that the SNS index is higher in the field assessment method and lower in the measurement method. We also adjusted the expected yield in the measurement method approach, in the adjusted approach. So we knew that these fields yielded higher from previous experiments, so we adjusted it to 10 tonnes per hectare and added on a little bit extra nitrogen for that. We also knew that the prices of the fertilizer and the grain were slightly different, so we adjusted those for the break-even ratio and knocked 10 kilos off for that basis. And that resulted in 70 more kilos of N per hectare being applied to the adjusted approach than to the standard approach. The other things that we changed, we just had one more split, and we also applied a bit of DAP because as phosphate as DAP. I would just note though that we didn't see any more phosphorus in the grain, so I don't think the 0.7 tonne per hectare yield increase that you're seeing from the adjusted approach is down to the additional phosphorus. We think it is primarily down to the fact that we put additional nitrogen on, which was primarily a result of using the measurement method as opposed to the field assessment method and a slight adjustment of nitrogen for yield. So although the gross margins in this season weren't different, we have used this, we've done the same trial a couple of years in a row and used a similar approach both years. And in each time we've got quite a decent increase in yield. And in the previous year, the gross margin was also significantly higher. The yields this year, I think, were limited because it was very wet, and we did lose a bit of nitrogen. So it's just an example of where we've tried it and did see some benefit as a result of using it. So the next example that I wanted to talk about was NDVI. It is one of many crop spectral reflectance indices. It's used in lots of different tools to estimate the greenness and the size of the crop canopy. It potentially could also be used to identify problem areas, so in that inspect stage of your crop checking, and also to check if your issues have been resolved when you're monitoring the crops after making any changes or adjustments. It is often, but not always, an indicator of nutrient stress, and that's because it is just looking at the greenness and the size of the canopy, which could be affected by things other than nutrients. So it is not necessarily always able to tell you if it's definitely a nutritional issue. I've just got an example of where we've used NDVI. We use it in trials quite often to monitor crops to see how they're doing. This is just an example where it's a winter wheat crop. We looked at it at growth stage 30, 32 and 39, and we had 4 different treatments. So these are little and often applications of nitrogen, so just more frequent, smaller doses. So we had an early little and often, an even N, little and often, and a standard N timings. And the numbers above each chart is the amount of nitrogen that was applied at that particular, at that point when the NDVI was taken. So you can see it is identifying differences between our N treatments based on how much has gone on and how it's responding. You can see that the early N, the even N caught up a little bit with the early little and often at this second timing, but then it dropped down again by the final timing. So it can pick up differences in N fertilizer uptake, but the effects can be transient. They can change with time. And this chart at the bottom here shows the yields. Now, none of these yields were significantly different, but also this final pattern in terms of the NDVI doesn't necessarily identically match the pattern that we're seeing in the yield. So the even N, for example, was at least equivalent to, if not slightly higher than the early little and often, whereas you might have predicted it to have been a bit lower based on the NDVI. So it's just bearing that in mind that it can be a bit transient and it doesn't always relate to the yields, but the NDVI can be quite a nice way of indicating how much nitrogen has been taken up by the crop. The next analysis that I was going to move on to as an example is the broad spectrum leaf analysis. So we don't have a huge amount of independent data on leaf analysis, but we have got data from Yen. So we've been having a look through that to see how it varies. And we can see that leaf micronutrients vary a lot more than the macronutrients. And we can see that the variation in these vary through time. So the contents of these, the levels in each crop vary through time. And actually what is maybe slightly surprising is that the levels before or at stem extension don't predict the levels at flag leaf or ear emergence. So they're not predictive of what's to come later in the season. Typically though, lower values, as you'd expect, indicate nutrient deficiencies, and higher values potentially indicate excess supplies of nutrients. So how do we tell which nutrients are deficient? The lab standards do vary. The target values vary between labs, and exact thresholds are quite uncertain still. So we do know that levels for NP and K typically decrease through the growth stages, but there's also other uncertainties of soil effects and weather effects, which we still don't have a good handle on. The values I've just put here are actually from an ADAS guide from the 1980s of minimum values that you need to see in leaves, but things probably have moved on a little bit since then, but this is the sort of last guidance that we had that was available. So in our opinion, on our kind of take on it, the best approach is to compare your sample with an adjacent area of better looking crop if you possibly can. I appreciate that generally means sending off more samples, it's more time consuming, but that is, if possible, the best approach to be able to identify where the differences are coming from and if they're differences that you can believe. In terms of is it worth it, because there's still a little bit of uncertainty in terms of how to interpret and what the values mean, the jury maybe is out still a little bit, but our take on it is that because there's also a lot of uncertainty and expense in getting your nutrient decisions right, then this is most likely to be beneficial, particularly on crops with a higher risk of deficiencies. So potentially a very good tool for helping you to interpret what's going on in your crop. So I've just got a couple of examples, and if this works, I am hopefully going to be able to zoom in to show you the values a little bit bigger. But before I do that, we've got the standard N treatment on the left and a nil N treatment on the right. So this is from the same field. It just goes just an example to show you why it's useful to take samples from two areas of crop which are different in how they're presenting. So before we do that, let's just have a look at what this typical lab analysis report looks like. So you can see the nutrients down the left-hand side and the result. There's a guideline value provided by the labs, and then there's an interpretation, which the labs have also done. The interpretation on the next page of this report, they'll explain how they've interpreted it, which is it's useful. It's nice to know that it's clear and transparent of how those assumptions have been made. And then there's some comments on what this means and what they would recommend you do about it. So that's the standard sample. For most things, it's looking pretty normal. If we move over to the nil N, you can see actually lots of things have now dropped into the low or slightly low categories. Interesting thing to note here is that this is in the same field, so it's unlikely that the soil is going to be deficient because you've seen that the standard treatment looks pretty good for most nutrients. But obviously the crop's struggling to take up nutrients. Potentially it could be because it's limited for nitrogen and that is limiting it taking up other nutrients. It could be because as a result of it being limited for nitrogen, perhaps the rooting isn't sufficient and it's unable to access the nutrients that are in the soil, but there's something else going on there. So they're not always necessarily straightforward to interpret, but it is useful, I think, in this scenario to show that it's worth comparing two different areas to identify what's going on. So if we just have a look at another lab output, just to show a different way of presenting it, this one has a benchmark range, a target range for which you want your value to be in. So you've got your element, your result, and then there's this range into which you're hoping your value sits. And if it's outside of that range, then they provide a comment and a few reasons potentially for why that's happening. So just to demonstrate that the values provided by the labs do differ, the approach that you can see the results also differ. So the main point to make there is really that it's important to pick a lab and stick with it, because if you're sending samples off to the same lab, then they're going to be comparable to each other, which is going to be a lot easier to interpret. Another type of lab and leaf analysis is the malate sulfate test. And we thought this was quite a useful one to mention because sulfur deposition has been significantly decreasing over the last 50 years because of reductions in emissions from power stations and industry. It's increasingly likely as a result of this that crops will become sulfur deficient. And we have seen this in our trials as well. So we've increasingly seen winter wheat crops, for example, that are starting to show some sulfur deficiency, which maybe haven't in the past. Just the thing to note is that sulfate is mobile in soils. It behaves very similarly to nitrogen, so it can easily be leached. So when I mentioned the wet winters that we've been seeing maybe more frequently in recent years, that's maybe the year to have a look and just check to bear in mind that you might start seeing some sulfur deficiency symptoms. So again, let's just have a quick look at what's in our B29 to remind ourselves of the guidance at the moment. So it's a difficult one, sulfur deficiency, is because by the time the symptoms appear, it can be too late to do anything about it. So the recommendation is that leaf tissue and grain analysis are the most robust approaches to use. Malate sulfate has been shown to be the most reliable lab analysis to detect sulfur deficiency in leaf tissue. So, and the approach to that is to take two tissue samples 2 weeks apart to help distinguish between permanent and transient sulfur deficiency, because there can be transient deficiencies as the crop's growing. There are guidelines for sampling and how to take the samples in RB29 as well. So I've taken another series of trials that we've done work on, and we've used this approach to see how it performed. So we had 6 winter wheat trials in the Little and Often trials funded by CF Fertilisers a few years ago. And you can see that we had 6 different sites. So we've got, and we did malate sulfate results tests at growth stage 31 and again at growth stage 32, 33. And these are the results that we got from those tests. The row below that, I've gone back to the yield data and had a look to see, because we had nil sulfur and then sulfur treated plots, to see if there was an effect of applying the sulfur on the yield. And in most cases, it did pretty accurately predict when there was going to be an issue or not. So there's 3 sites where it was quite clear that it was either sufficient or deficient. And when it was deficient, when we applied sulfate, it did respond. There were a couple of situations where it was a bit borderline and it wasn't maybe as straightforward to identify what was going on. And in both of those situations, when we applied sulfate, it did increase the yield. So it did identify that it was becoming deficient, which is helpful. And then there was one where it looked like it was maybe a transient effect, because it appeared to be, it only appeared at one timing. It shifted from sufficient to deficient. However, there was no effect of applying sulfate in that treatment. So that must have just been a transient effect that we picked up in that result. So in most cases, it was a successful approach to identify the deficiency, but it does take a little bit of interpreting. Another series of trials that were done in recent years was on oilseed rape as well. So these trials were all in winter wheat. These 18 trials were in oilseed rape, and 13 out of 18 of those trials, malate sulfate detected the sulfur deficiency effectively. So it is a pretty reliable method, but it just takes a little bit of interpreting to make sure. And it's obviously very important that you do the 2 samples to make sure you can tell if they are transient or permanent effects. The final example that I've got to talk about is SAP analysis. I don't have very much information on this, I'm afraid, because there's very little independent information available. Just to note that the UK does have a SAP analysis lab. The sampling method is very different to leaf analysis. This is just a report from a lab technician from Sweden who has done lots and lots of leaf and sap analysis. And this is their personal opinion on which one is better and why. And they actually preferred sap analysis compared to leaf analysis for the reasons shown in the table. We've been discussing this and thinking about it ourselves as well. And although leaf analysis can only work as a snapshot, because as I mentioned earlier, it does change over time, it does have a lot more information available for interpretation, and that's really important for being able to make conclusions about what to do with the result that you're being presented with. SAP analysis, though, has its own niche, so I think it potentially could be quite useful if you've got lots of samples taken at the same time. And it is also a very quick turnaround for the lab analysis, so potentially could be very useful in season for getting a quick turnaround if you want to have a quick look. And then the main thing is, and I'm just going to reiterate this, I know I mentioned it earlier, but it is super important to be consistent if you're sending samples to the lab. So make sure you use the same lab and stick with it, because they do differ in how they analyze samples, and you want to be able to compare your results over time. So it's important to sort of just pick a lab and stick with it so that you can be consistent. And this is my final slide. It's just to remind us of the key steps of the check and adjust. So I've created a check and adjust checklist. So really the first step is to plan. So identify which fields have the most uncertain nutrition plans. Inspect when you're doing your crop walking. Make sure you use the crop as an indicator to identify any uncertain areas. Carry out checks on those uncertain areas to identify any issues, and then compare the results from your uncertain areas with areas that look a little bit better to see if you can tell if it is down to nutrition or there's something else going on. If you're convinced it is down to nutrition, then you can adjust and try and change your nutrient recommendation either in season or potentially if it's too late this season in the future. And then finally, move on to testing. So if you can, leave an area untreated to see if your adjustment has worked. and then move on to reviewing, which is monitoring the effects both in season and also post harvest. So that's a summary of the principles of a few of those ideas. Like I say, that's not exhaustive. We're going to move on in a moment to a Q&A session, but I think Sarah and I will now take some questions if there are any in the chat.
So we've got one from Ali Arden in the chat. So it says, what do you think about the efficiency of crop tissue sampling? When you sample the plant parts which should be sampled, crops can occasionally not exhibit visual symptoms, but you could still have a nutritional subclinical issue. And how do we make sure we capture that in season?
Yeah, so you're saying if there's not something that is visual at the time, but there may still be something going on that you can't yet see in the crop. That's a really good question, and it is difficult. I mean, I think in that situation, if you're at all uncertain about a field and you think it might be a reason to have or move into a nutritional deficiency, then it would be worth considering checking that as an uncertain field. So as when you're making your plan or you're familiar with your fields from what you've seen in previous years, perhaps you've had grain analysis done in a previous year and it's looked a little bit borderline on a particular nutrient, then it would be worth following that up, even if you can't see visual symptoms, to see if there is anything going on. But it is a difficult one because you probably don't necessarily want to do leaf analysis on every single field because that would be quite a lot of work. So trying to pick out the fields that you think are at risk is probably what I would suggest doing. But I don't know, Sarah, if you've got any additional thoughts on that.
I mean, I suppose in an ideal situation, if time and cost weren't a limitation here, regularly taking leaf analysis samples across many fields at several points through the season would give you lots of information about what's actually going on in terms of uptake and the supply of nutrients. But there probably does need to be a level of prioritization here. And I think you're right, Ali. Obviously, if you think about what good nutrient management looks like, then essentially trying to avoid getting to the point where deficiency symptoms are present is what we should be aiming for. So anything that can help to prevent actually deficiencies occurring is a positive thing. But I guess it needs to be weighed up in terms of, the effort that's put in. I can see there's another question, but I think we should move on now to the discussion with Andrew and David, and we can have a look at the question, see if we can address that in the Q&A, or maybe we can reply to it in the chat. So I'm really pleased that we've got Andre Williamson and David Aglen here this morning to join us. We're going to kick off this discussion. If you both want to turn your cameras on now, that would be great. With you both providing a bit of an introduction and sharing, I suppose, with us what's driving you to make improvements to nutrient management on your farm. Andrew, maybe if you're happy to start.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. So my name's Andre Williamson. I'm an arable farmer from South Shropshire near Bridgnorth. We farm about 900 acres of wheat, barley, oats, oilseed rape and beans. And we don't have any livestock, even though we're in a mixed area. And when we did have livestock, we didn't have enough to leave us with a legacy of a lot of nitrogen manure use. So what drives me really, nitrogen use efficiency is what drives me. And it's all down to trying to get the very most out of what we're putting on. We've got to try and understand how we use it better for lots of reasons: economic, social, environmental, that sort of thing. I guess the full focus of mine when the price of fertilizer went through the roof, and trying to get it used as efficiently as possible. And ultimately, we need to make sure it's paying for itself and we're getting the best output out of it. So that's a very, very brief introduction from what we're doing here.
Thanks, Andrew. David, over to you for a bit of an introduction, please.
Thanks, Kate and Sarah. That was a fascinating talk and reminding me of some of the reasons we're doing some of this. My name's David Aglen. I've been managing a mixed farming business in Fife for a number of years now, and we've been this type of nutrient analysis from agreeing with Andrew along the nitrogen use efficiency, which of course became very prevalent when nitrogen prices went through the roof a few years ago. But also from a disease perspective, there seems to be a lot of information out there in the world that unhealthy plants and indeed animals and people succumb to disease more readily. And the notion that if we can keep our plants healthy and balanced nutritionally, then we won't get so much disease, which then reduces the use requirement of fungicides. And given that fungicides, etc., are having resistance issues every year, that was one of the main drivers that we chose here to investigate the nutrients within the plants through the season.
Thanks, David. I mean, obviously, what we've been talking about this morning has been focused on in-season checks that we can make. So I'm interested in your perspective, I suppose, if we consider spring as it is at the moment, how in-season measurements are helping to optimize nutrient management on your farms, or how you've used that in the past. And are there any measurements, or are there any tools that you would use or recommend that can help you and should be prioritized?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a difficult. There's so many tools out there, as we saw this morning. Which one to use? What we've tried. I mean, soil mineral nitrogen. It's been around a long time, but even that was put up earlier, it's so variable that I haven't used that for a long time. We've been using the N tester a bit throughout the season. I'm not sure the leaves are big enough to actually use this at this time of year. And it tends to just go on the gut at this time of year, a bit what the crop looks like. You know, historically, we've got a wonderful spring this year. You can pick your days to do anything. It certainly wasn't like that last year, when you just had to get out and get stuff done on the few days you could. So early season, I think, personally, I just go with what feels right, because until the plants really got growing, it's, you know, soil's cooler just now. There's so many limiting factors to the nutrition that the plant is taking up. The biology is maybe not going as hard as we want it to, and that maybe doesn't happen until later in April up here. So again, at the start of the season is a bit tricky. It's a hard question to answer. So thanks, Andrew.
David, you mentioned the N tester and obviously using that a bit later in the season. Can you just give any kind of thoughts or comment on your experience? How are you kind of integrating that into your management? And do you use the recommendations from that, or do you use those recommendations to help tweak what you might already be planning to do?
Yes, we've been working with Roger Sylvester Bradley on this project for the last 3 years, and he's certain, I think he's probably right, that I don't use enough nitrogen. And so we put the N tester to test on some tram lines to see, you know, it was telling us to put up to 100 kilos more on, and we did get a yield response from using it. So in some instances it does appear to be correct. It's just balancing that. You know, when it's pushing you towards 300 kilos of nitrogen on feed wheat, you're thinking, well, this needs to stand up so we can harvest the crop. So that, again, a bit of personal judgment perhaps needs to come in there. But it certainly seems it's useful, and it picks up differences that we can't see by the eye.
Yeah. Andrew, thoughts from you in terms of the measurements that you make, or any kind of tools, analyses that you think people should be kind of routinely using?
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of stuff that David said, and we've done some soil mineral nitrogen. We've done a soil mineral nitrogen test this year with another project we're involved with, looking at nitrogen use efficiency, and that's telling me we've got 111 kilos of nitrogen available on the SNS. And I'm a little bit skeptical of, because that's accurate for the point of the field they took the test from. And I know from everything else we've got huge variability within fields. Just look at some satellite data now, and if they took it from the one part, it would have gone out. Other parts, it isn't there. So we've used a Yara N sensor for the last, well, it's getting close to 20 years now, which is quite frightening. So I'm a big believer of using the crop to tell us what there, and because we've got a big variation within the crops, and being able to adjust that in real time as you go across the field is valuable. And a lot of the time it's not, particularly this time of the year, it's not really nitrogen that's holding back crops, our crops. We talk about a dry spring, which we're having at the moment, but we also had a very wet winter. So looking at rainfall, we had 250 mil of rain from the 1st of October till December. We've only had 120 since the beginning of January, so it's dry now. And fertilizer we've already put on has probably not quite been taken up by the crop. So I'm in the dilemma at the moment whether I put any more on now because conditions are so good and great, but what's going to happen? So we need to go there. But I think probably using the crop will be my take home to, and we have used the end tester as well on regular times, but we've got to use the crop to tell us what we're doing and try and adjust it accordingly. And in stuff we've done in the past, I'm quite cautious about dropping nitrogen rates too low because we've seen quite dramatic effects of falling off the shoulder of the nitrogen response curve, basically.
You've both obviously, and we have earlier in the presentation, focused predominantly on managing nitrogen. Do either of you have any kind of thoughts or comments about how we can monitor crops or use measurements for other nutrients? I mean, any comments from a micronutrient perspective, for example?
Well, we've done, I'll let David have a bit of thinking time. We've come back from doing various leaf tissue tests in the past with different projects we're involved with, and normally the same nutrients come back low every time. We're always low on boron. Zinc is often low, and other ones. And again, it comes back to, and I'm a great believer of, it's very easy to measure stuff, but then we need to understand what we do with it, and that's the challenge. So it's quite easy to go and take some tissue tests, send it off to a lab, get some nice pictures back with nice bar graphs and everything else. But what do we do, and is that representative? Is that just that part of the field? Is it everywhere else? And how do we use that? So that's the real challenge, I think. And again, it comes back to whether the crop looks healthy and using that crop to tell us. And again, checking from, we've done ones where we've checked from one part to the other, tested bits will look good, tested bits which don't look good. And often I think we all head to the bits which are poor to test, and perhaps we ought to be looking at the good bits and find out that looks really healthy. What are the levels in there? And if the levels are the same in the unhealthy bit, it's probably not that that's causing it. It could be something else. It could be soil type. It could be water holding capacity. It could be all sorts of things, and nothing to do with what you're going to put on it. It's just inherent variability which you've got to deal with, basically.
Yeah, it's nearly building that picture, and I think you've made a good comment there about not necessarily just testing the poor bits and actually understanding if you look at better bits of the field, what do they look like from a nutritional perspective? David, any thoughts from you in terms of maybe have you used leaf analysis? Have you used sap analysis in the past? Are those things that you would see as an important component of how you manage nutrition?
Yes, I would. I agree with Andrew's comments. So the variability that nature gives us is far greater than we can probably measure realistically. But we were using sap analysis for a while when it kind of became all the rage, and it was easy when we were still in the EU, we could get samples across to Holland quite easily. And yes, the turnaround was good and the results appeared good. Looking at kind of the comparator is that it's a bit like taking a blood sample. It's compared to a tissue sample, it's giving you a live indicator of what the plant's doing at that time. Since we find it a bit harder since we come out of the EU to get samples across the continent for varying reasons, and it's not been as reliable in this country, and it became very time consuming to do it. So we got a year or two of results and thought, well, it's given us a guide. There is technology, I think, coming on stream, much more economical, that we can start getting more trace element results in field, which looks a bit more interesting, because really the biggest problem with sap or tissue is that you send it off, you take a sample, send it to the lab, 5 to 7 days later you get the result back, by which time the crop could have changed. Then you've got to get the product, as Andrew says, to try and change the result if you need to. So it's quite a long lead time to getting the result, taking the sample rather, to actually responding to it. But if we can get in field, if we can get live data in field, then we can get the product or something on the next day to help things, as it were. And it's also worth bearing in mind how the results are interpreted, in that most of the results that labs have, and they'll all be pretty much the same, they're based on a range of samples that they've taken. So we don't actually know what the healthy crop should look like. It's just the sample you send in falls into that bracket between all the samples that these labs have had over X number of years. So I think from our point of view, when we're looking at disease control and keeping crops healthier that way, we need to start to understand how healthy a crop needs to be in terms of nutritional status before disease isn't an issue. Yeah.
I mean, you've both kind of mentioned several different methods that you've used or you might use currently. How do you go about managing all the data and the information that come with those measurements or come with those observations? And do you see that as a limitation to doing more checking because managing the data is complicated?
I think the short answer is a box file on the shelf in the office. That's where the data gets managed. But no, in all seriousness, I think it was alluded to in the past. It's building up a picture over the years, in that you can do sap or tissue or what have you for 1 year, and it gives you a nice set of results. But is it just that year, that crop, etc.? So I think it's taking 2-3 years before you can build a picture of what your farm does, before you really can start reacting to the data. Is my kind of feeling on it at the minute.
Andrew, thoughts on that?
Well, I think yes, we develop a lot of data, we generate a lot of data, and it involves a lot of time sat in this office that I'm sat in now, and when the day is nice and sunny and it's a forecast, it's quite tricky to get out. We're quite keen to sit in offices in January and February time when it's nice and cold and wet and miserable, but we've got to be able to learn how to interpret that data, and that's as I alluded to before, that's the difficult bit. It's measuring. It's easy. You can easily gather data. It's understanding what to do with it, how to utilize it, and understand it's giving you the right decision. And there are ways around that, and it is getting better. And one of the things that I'm quite keen on, and I've always advocated, is we need to try and make sure that the data is more mobile and we can access it when we need it, and out in the field or wherever. And that's probably partly why I like things like the end test, which David mentioned. You can go out, pop out in the field, take a check, and do it. We've done fields we've done every week, and it gives you an idea, it gives you a snapshot, see how things are moving. The other thing we're also looking at the moment is we've got some soil probes in one of the fields looking at soil moisture and temperature, which again is giving us real-time data, sort of every 15 minutes, and you can see that on your phone or on your office computer, and that's quite valuable, I think, because it's giving us a better idea of. So I mentioned before about putting more fertilizer on, even though probably the last lot we haven't put on hasn't been taken up because we've only had 8.5 mil of rain in March. But the soil temperature moving up, the crops are starting to move. That soil from SMS is probably getting mineralized, so probably we do need to start topping it up again. And you can see that it's not just a hunch. We can see it definitely, soil temperature moving in the right direction. Moisture's still there, so we probably justify the decision to do it more. And I'm cautious. My agronomist is on the call, I think, so he'll probably tell me not to tomorrow, or get off the call and ring me up and just tell me to hold my foot up. But there we go.
We're getting close to 9:30 now. I just wondered whether either of you had kind of a final comment in terms of, a priority or something that you're kind of trying to focus on this season from a nutrient perspective. You both talked about nitrogen use efficiency, so I suppose, what does that mean for you this season? Is there anything imminent that you're going to be doing? David, any thoughts?
I think this year most winter crops look really good. Spring crops are going in fantastic conditions up here, like we've not seen for a while. It's all to play for, and I think, like every season, we've just got to, if it's a season for putting a bit more N on because the yield potential's there, or there's, as Andrew's test is saying, lots more in the soil for a year for using it. And yeah, do some testing, get some information, and speak to people and discuss the results and go from there.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think we've got to try and optimise. We've got to try and get as much as possible out of what we're putting on, whatever that is, whether it's nitrogen or anything else. Just the economics of the job at the moment means you've got to try and get as much out of it as possible and be as efficient as possible.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, we're now at 9:30, so we'll wrap up. I hope you've all found the information and discussion useful this morning. Thank you so much to David and Andrew for sharing your insights and experiences, and to Kate for your really useful presentation. And thanks also to Bree and Laurie for helping with the organisation, and to all of you for joining. And I hope you have a good day, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar where we will focus on the review step before harvest. Thanks a lot.